Hello, my name's Steve Glazer. I'm the team leader for the CITRIS Thrust and Intelligent Infrastructure. I'd like to welcome you to our talk today. We'd like to first of all thank Infineon for sponsoring the lunch, which is probably our most important thanks. I'd like to welcome our web viewers wherever you may be. Announcements, there's flyers for the I for Energy talk. It's going to be the last talk of the semester, and they're sitting in the back. There will be a talk on the 23rd, on Monday, by Deborah Estrin from UCLA, who runs the Sensing Center down there. Her talk will be participatory sensing from ecosystems to human systems. So it really fits in quite nicely with our talk today. Our speaker today is Jay Lund, a professor at UC Davis. His interests are looking at analysis of systems, economic management, infrastructure, public works problems. His main focus is on water resources and environmental systems, but he also does work with solid waste, waste management, dredging coastal zones, urban regional transportation planning, and in addition to the technical areas, the more technical areas, he's doing more qualitative technical work in policy planning and management studies. So working with the water in California, you can't have one without the other. So today's talk is entitled Calvin's Adventures in Modeling California's Statewide Water System. And we all know that water is a very precious resource in California, and the apportionment of our water supply has very serious economic and political consequences. In addition to all these political pullings and shovings, the system still has to follow physical laws. Professor Lund has created a model, a hydroeconomic model, which is called Calvin, in order to explore the capabilities of the water system and to look how, when you change aspects of the systems, the economical response. The changes that can be modeled in the system include institutional conditions, population growth, climate change, failure of facilities, new technology, and environmental restoration. And even though we have this, we'll hear about this wonderful, powerful model, there's still even simpler models can give you at least some insight. But what we'll hear today is a model that takes all these aspects into account. So, Professor Lund.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, from the introduction, you've probably learned a couple of things. First of all, I have a very short attention span. I can't work on one thing for very long. And in fact, this is probably the thing that I have worked on the longest in my career. And for better or worse, you can tell me at the end of the talk, it probably will continue for some time. So what I'm going to talk about today is this Calvin model we've developed for California, and we've also developed a version of it for Baja, California, down in Mexico. We have a lot of collaborators on this, and I've color-coded them for you. There's myself in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and now the director of the Center for Watershed Sciences on the UC Davis campus, and Richard Howitt, who's the chair of the Agricultural Resource Economics Department at UC Davis. He's in green, I'm in blue. The water engineers are in blue. The economists are in green. And Josue Medellin, who's now a professional researcher at Davis, who's sort of a hybrid between the two of us, which I think is fitting for this title, where we're trying to combine physical reality and sort of social reality and social norms to see what we ought to be doing here. Everything I talked about, all the projects I've talked about, and a whole bunch more are available on this website, including documentation for all the models and those kinds of things. So the person who introduced me implied that I actually made this model myself. This is far too big of a project for any professor to do. No professor in their right mind would allow themselves to do this or trust themselves to do this, frankly. So one thing that I think it's important is to sort of, you can't see this because I should have blurred out the back a little bit, but we've had probably 20 or so graduate students from different disciplines. You can see the different color codings, computer science, engineering, economics, resource economics, law, all kinds of geography, all kinds of folks helping us out with this over time. And we have a good time doing it. That's, I think, an important aspect. Any kind of large multidisciplinary project, the people have to enjoy doing it. Otherwise, it becomes a divide the loot club, which is what we often see at the university. A lot of thanks to be given not only to the people that actually did the work, but to various folks from whom we stole software or they let us kindly use their software, the HSC PRM optimization code from the Army Corps of Engineers, all the agencies who gave us data. Certainly, if you're going to make anything close to a detailed model of California's water system, you're going to be relying on other people for data. And one of our mottos as we built this was we would like to be able to blame someone else for as much data as possible. We want to generate as little as we can on our own because other people will have spent their careers developing data, and that should have a little better quality than what we do over a weekend. And we had a wonderful advisory committee that had Anthony Saraceno, who's now the head of the water program for the Nature Conservancy in California, help us out in terms of how can we make this project more useful for policy people. You know, how do we articulate the nature of this project for them? And I think that also helped us in thinking about how we wanted to do model runs. Still more thanks to all the people that gave us money. We've certainly had well over $1 million on this project over time. We still have a lot more money coming along, hopefully over time. As a researcher, as an academic, one of the things I really like about this project is I have never had to write a proposal more than 5 pages long since we started this, because people could appreciate immediately the value of this kind of work, and I didn't have to sell anybody on it. That's really, really a good thing. California has a very complex water system. You can see on this those of you that are not familiar with water, the triangles in our kind of nomenclature, they're not diodes, they are reservoirs. And we have upside down sort of brown triangles. Those are aquifers, underground reservoirs. We have above ground reservoirs. We have pumping stations. We have canals. We have rivers, all kinds of facilities, pumping plants, hydropower plants, treatment plants, all kinds of stuff. And it's very highly interconnected. This is probably one of the most interconnected water systems in the entire world. Certainly one of the wealthiest and probably more economic output comes off of this system than any other in the world. California has some very serious water problems. I think depending upon who you talk to, you'll get a different answer as to which problems rise to the top. But sort of to give a larger strategic view of it all, over time, California's water system is getting tighter and tighter. Okay, we have more and more people, we have more water demands, we have more diverse water demands. So over time, not only have we increased the existing water demands, but we've diversified the types of water demands. We now have demands for different types of water quality that we didn't have so much before. We have now demands for different types of environmental flows that we didn't consider before. So that all makes it a much more interesting problem for us to work on. A second big change that I think is going to endure for a long time is the limits of federal and state leadership. When much of this system was constructed, the federal and state governments had really a fairly good consensus as to what the future of California's water system should be. They should build dams and build canal systems and deliver water so we could farm everything. Okay? And everyone should have all the water they would ever want. At that time, the federal and state governments also had an awful lot more money than they do now. So we're looking today, I think, I read in the Sacramento Bee today, that we're looking at another $20 billion hole in the ground over in the state budget. In addition to the $20 billion hole in the ground we had last year, federal government, today we have these surplus funds, these stimulus funds, but we're going to not have those in a few years. That's pretty clear. So we have really a great limitation now and into the future on the physical capability and also the political capability and political consensus that's available to put forth large-scale solutions to California's water problems. What we're seeing, and I think you can see it for the last 20 years, is really a return to local initiatives and local options and local finance. The state and federal governments are broke. Who has water problems? When you have a water problem, who feels it first? the local water users, the local farmers, the local cities. They're going to be the ones that feel it first. They're fortunately also the ones that have the easiest time raising money. And how do they raise money? Through your water bills. So if you look at water districts, they tend to be among the better off governments in the state of California these days. If you look at the kind of options we're considering for the future of California's water supply, what are we looking at? Things like water conservation, wastewater reuse, conjunctive use of surface and groundwater. We're looking at water markets. All of these things, most of these things tend to be things that the locals actually have a comparative advantage institutionally in implementing relative to a large federal or state agency, with the exception of some things like plumbing codes. There's certainly important roles in the long term for federal and state agencies, but we need to keep in mind that many of the local technologies that are most promising into the future are actually better implemented at the local level. So that's fortunate because the state and federal governments are going to have diminished capability in this area. And I'd like to also point out that this is actually returned to sort of classical American water management. If you look at the history of American water management and how water in particular is managed in most of California, but really especially in the eastern part of the U.S., it's almost entirely managed. The infrastructure is developed, managed, financed, built, operated by local governments. The state really has very little to do with it. The feds have almost nothing to do with it, except in terms of environmental regulations and public health regulations. So we're seeing a return back to local initiative away from state and federal leadership. We're seeing the limits of traditional solutions. And you'll see some slides on this, where the traditional things that we did during the infrastructure development era, we've done the most effective items on that list. We've built dams at the best dam sites. We've built canals at most of the best canal sites. There's really diminishing marginal returns to traditional infrastructure development. There's certainly a role for it in some times and places, but we'll be doing it a little bit differently, and we'll be doing it in conjunction with a lot of other things that are primarily at the local level. Final big strategic change is in terms of water development institutions or water management institutions. Water management is now much more multi-focused. It's very hard to have a flood control project that's separate from an environmental project, that's separate from a water supply project, that's separate from a wastewater project. The increasing complexity and the increasing density of our human interactions with the landscape are pressing us to have a much more integrated view of all these different functions of water that traditionally we've kept sort of stovepiped in different organizations. This has, that sounds all very good, but integrated water management is hard. Managing one thing at a time is hard enough, but to manage all of this together is really a great technical challenge, and it's a tremendous institutional challenge, because in order to do the technical work, it has to fall within an institutional, legal, and political financial setting. So what we're going to see also here is continued decentralization in many ways, but it's going to be, we're seeing the benefits of that in the chaos. So we already have a pretty decentralized system. We're going to have to re-decentralize it in some ways. I'm not sure what it'll look like, but it'll have to be a little bit different. Just to go back to the water supply side a little bit on the regional, interregional sense. When we manage water, we have a lot of things we can do with it. If you look at the East Bay MUD's water supply, the folks that supply water to Berkeley, what activities do they have that they can use to help manage water? They have all kinds of water conservation activities, right? They might have dozens of those. And those get implemented in millions of households, or certainly hundreds of thousands of households. So every household is making dozens of water management decisions on its own every day. You have interactions with the utility on those matters. The utility has a lot of activities that it can do in terms of regulating pressure and planning and incentives for people to change their behavior. They also have the reservoir system, conjunctive use, treatment, reuse, all those kinds of decisions. If you add them up, if you took the time to add them up, and it would take you a very long time, you will probably find that they have hundreds or thousands, really, of decisions that they can make. You don't make one of these decisions. You make an orchestra of these decisions, a portfolio of these decisions. And if you wanted to look at all possible combinations of all those decisions in the traditional simulation method, you would never finish that. I mean, it would be more than your retirement to do that. So we really have a very complex situation, even at the local level. And then we also have the state activities that mix in with this. And so for the state of California, we're looking at a mix of local activities that are pretty diverse, state activities that are quite diverse. And the important problem is how do we coordinate this mix of responses? And again, it has tremendous technical and institutional problems that go along with that. Let's forward through these. This annoying slide. So the approach that we're taking here is develop computer models. So if you think of any other large technical enterprise that you interact with, say an airplane, how did that airplane come into being? Did you have a lot of politicians sit down together around a table and decide what it should look like? And certainly there were marketing people that were involved in that, but you had a tremendous technical enterprise which was very carefully organized and orchestrated with all kinds of feedbacks and quality control activities going on. So what I think I'm proposing here is that we take that kind of a view, something that we know we have to do in order to make complex technical things work. Take that same kind of view of our water system. And so what I'm proposing is sort of a primitive hydroeconomic model of this kind of a system. And so this is sort of a cartoon of what a river basin looks like. It has water sources of different types. It has groundwater. It has reservoirs. It has different kinds of demands, different cities, agriculture, fish someplace in here, money all over the place. And for each demand, we have essentially a penalty function if you don't deliver all the water they would like. There's some shortage that these people feel which has some economic measure of their pain. Okay? So if a farmer gets less water than they would like, the way they feel that pain is they're getting less profit than they would like out of that, or having actual losses out of that business enterprise. Same kind of thing with many of the cities. So what we try to do in this kind of modeling framework is integrate these water sources, the demands at different locations and of different types, the various forms of infrastructure that we have to work on, that we have to manage this system, that we have operational decisions and planning decisions to make, and then examine these operational decisions in terms of economic performance, both in terms of water scarcity costs, the cost of you not getting all the water you would like, and the operating cost of that system in terms of pumping and treatment and things like that. We also have environmental flows in this system because environment is important to us these days. And we're going to look at that as constraints on the system. So essentially, as someone pointed out in one of their early presentations on this, the environment gets its water first. And we're going to use this modeling framework, much like you would use any kind of simulation model or any kind of modeling that would be done for developing a new Boeing airplane, to explore different combinations of these decisions. We're going to try to develop and explore different management portfolios for this system. And so the model's name is Calvin. Calvin is a wonderful university product. It has two personality types. Those of you that have done modeling, have you ever worked with a model and then met the person that programmed the model, made the model, and then you can see, oh, this model is kind of a reflection of that person's personality. So this is a good university personality where we're trying to do a couple of things here. First of all, Calvin has sort of a strict religious reformer idea. We're trying to add some discipline to what is a very chaotic, very difficult problem that's very complex. And we think the discipline will help in helping people see the truth in what should be done, or what different truths about what might be done depending on your objective. And Calvin also very much has this sort of mischievous 5-year-old personality to it. Nobody likes us big picture people. That's an actual Calvin cartoon. I like it very much. The name Calvin, actually, we had a very long series of meetings trying to get this project going. And at each meeting, the question of the graduate students was, what should we name this big thing? We knew we needed to have a killer name. And someday, one of the days, one of the students came up with the name Calvin, and that sort of stuck. And I like this name very much because there's another model that I'll touch on here that was being developed by Richard Howitt, which estimates the economic value of water supplied to agriculture. And I was hoping that when we named our model Calvin, he would name his model Hobbs. Right, you guys get it. He didn't do that, however. He named it SWAP for some reason. But that's fine. It's a very good model. And our ambitions at the time, you have to remember this was in 1998, so this is a very old model now. In model years, this is like 100 years old. So we tried to have the very first, and we did have the very first, still, and actually it still is the only intertide model of the entire California water system. So we have the surface water, the groundwater, the supplies, the demands, the Central Valley Project, the State Water Project, the Colorado River Project, the local projects. We got them all the big ones anyway. Because this is how the system is really operated now. If you look at the droughts, in the drought that we're in now, how are actual people operating it? They're operating it like an integrated system, not as the sum of individual water projects. And we wanted to be able to represent that. And how are people operating that system? They're operating it mostly, overwhelmingly, for their economic benefits. Certainly for the agricultural folks, they're businessmen. And if they're not businessmen, they're probably not going to be farmers for all that long. Many of the urban areas are primarily driven by economic aspects. Certainly hydropower is. So we have an economic optimization model, and we use that optimization to make the decisions within constraints of certainly the physics, but also environmental flows and those kinds of policies. We look at these decisions monthly over a 72-year period, and for the most part, that 72-year period is represented by the historical flows into the system. So we're sort of looking at the past as representing the kind of variability in the hydrology that we have in California. We certainly have been looking at some climate change studies, and I'll touch on some of those. The most important benefit of this model occurs before you even run it, before you look at any numerical outputs. This model, just constructing the model, forces you to develop an integrated quantitative understanding of the system. You can't really manage something that you have a hard time understanding, and computers, being as dim and dumb as they are very good at making sure you explain every little detail to that computer. And that you learn a lot from doing that. Those of you that have taught, have you ever had a sort of a very persistent, somewhat dim student that asks you questions all the time, but the rest of the class really benefits from that sort of dim, persistent student, and you actually benefit from that dim, persistent student because he forces you, or she forces you to put it all together in very precise terms. So our model of California, the schematic of our model, when superimposed on the map of California, looks like this. I have a scroll version of that, and I'll just unroll that because this is a very useful prop, actually. This is California's water system. I need a volunteer from the audience. And so this is the system, right? And this is the only schematic that exists of the entire system. It was made by University of California students, right? So never let people tell you that students can't do anything. So this is the real system, and it helps a lot when we're talking, here we are at the university, we go to agencies, and they just view us as a bunch of pointy heads. But when we start to unroll this kind of schematic, they say, oh, you actually have been looking at these details. You're not just a bunch of pointy heads. So I think it's important when you do these kinds of activities, whether you're doing them in California water or any other activity, most real people in the so-called real world, which in many ways represents a series of surreal worlds, they need to see some proof that you're being serious about these things. And this kind of scroll, this kind of theatrical demonstration is very useful. There's math behind this. Fortunately, there's very little math. Well, it's very simple math, but there's a lot of it. I should put it that way. In making a very complex model of this system, we had a choice. We could either have a very elaborate methodology, which would be very computationally difficult, or we can have a very simple method that we could apply very extensively. And we chose the second path. So this is sort of 1970s modeling optimization technology. But it's a generalized network flow algorithm. So all the x's are decision variables, which will be flows, storages, desalinization, wastewater reuse, conservation, all those things, with a little cost coefficient in front of it. We can make this nonlinear in terms of making it convex by piecewise linear. We have conservation of mass constraints with losses and external inflows. We have upper bounds and lower bounds on storages, environmental flows, all kinds of things. So we have these 4 little equations, but we've got like 1 million of each of them. Okay, so that's really the scale. You want to have simple math, but a lot of it for this system. And you'll notice that, well, for each of these little equations, I only have 1 or 2 parameters to estimate, but wait a minute, I got 1 million of these things. So I got a lot of parameters to estimate. So we have a tremendous data management problem, estimation problem, and then data management problem, and then documentation problem. The model we use to solve this is HEC-PRM, which we got from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Hydrologic Engineering Center. We'd worked on using this model earlier for some smaller systems on the Missouri River system that had 6 reservoirs. Columbia River system has about 14 reservoirs in that model. And then the California model has about 100 reservoirs, if you include the groundwater and surface water. So we had to develop a lot of software to make that work.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
So this is a static model, right? I mean, this model is static. It doesn't have time components.
No, it does. We have I and J are in time and space. I is one place in time and space. J is another place in time and space. No, it covers 72 years, monthly hydrology. So really what we're wanting to do here is integrate a representation of the surface and groundwater hydrology, all those flows that come out of the mountains, the water and the groundwater, things like that, physical capacities of the system and the facilities, environmental flow constraints, urban water values estimated by price elasticities of demand, very simple, again, way of doing it, and then agricultural water values estimated by a more complex means. And then we have operating costs and hydropower and those kinds of things. All of this information we put into a set of databases. There's an HEC DSS database of time series information and penalty functions. And then there's a moderate size access database of all the other parameters. In that database, we also keep the metadata. So for every one of those parameters that was in the mathematical formulation, we have about 5 fields of which student got that data, who did they get it from, what's the contact information of that person, where in a directory structure is the Word and Excel document that explains where that number came from, right? And then a final field of how much did you have to hold your nose as you type that parameter in? You know, how much faith do you have in that numerical value so that we can screen these data for a lot of different things. This, including the metadata in the database, is tremendously important. We have so much data, and this work is being done by students. And what do students like to do? Anybody students here? What do you want to do in a couple of years? You want to still be here as a student? You want to graduate, right? So our first student that was here, we knew we had to do that. We had to have this documentation. But our first student had been a little bit lax about it, and unfortunately he took a job with a Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic working on a village water supply. This was before cell phones were common in that part of the world. And we had no idea what he did in that model. And so the next student, we had to get religion about this, right? So now we have a much better metadata. And this gives you a lot more discipline also. A lot of modeling at this scale is about the disciplines and the protocol and the standards you set and the culture of modeling that you develop. So all of this goes then is we have software that takes all the data and pushes it into this optimization software, and out of that comes all the wonderful things that we have on the right-hand side. I want to point out here a benefit of merging of this hydroeconomic model. So we're taking really an engineering model that has physics and decisions in it, and we're taking an economics model in the objective function. And you're getting more than if you had a separate economic and a separate engineering model. You're getting the two benefits of them both coming together. And I'll point out a couple of these here. At the bottom here, the values of increased facility capacities. So in the model, as an optimization model, we're getting a lot of Lagrange multipliers or shadow values. So for every time we have a constraint on capacities or environmental flows or whatever, water demands, we're getting a value on that shadow value on that constraint, which has a lot of good policy and planning utility, more than if we'd had a maximized water delivery objective function, which would be kind of dumb, but more common. We also get the willingness to pay of each water demand for additional water, or how much they'd be, in principle, how much they'd be willing to be paid to sell some or reduce their water use. So we get a lot of benefits from having both of these together. This just shows what some of those economic value functions look like for agriculture. So this is from the SWAP model. We have all these different areas of California modeled. Each of these is a separate, or actually it runs together. It's profit. The SWAP model maximizes agricultural production and crop mix decisions and water use decisions for each of these regions, just like a farmer would try to. And we use that to estimate economic value functions for water deliveries to agriculture. So you can see in different months they have different amounts of water, and as you deliver more and more water, it becomes less and less valuable at the margin. These statewide water management activities, this is largely the same slide I showed before. What we're trying to do in the model is represent as many of these real options as we can, because we're looking at an integrated water management problem. We're trying to develop portfolios of economically promising solutions. And so that's what we're trying to do here. Integrated mix of actions across local and state levels. It's essentially a portfolio planning problem. As a university, we're doing this for academic purposes. We have to have some academic purposes, certainly for research. We got a pile of papers out of this. We have a lot of, it's just great for students. Pretty much every student that comes out of this project is snapped up very quickly by agencies, academics, consulting firms. And probably our most mischievous area of interest is to educate the California water modeling community about some of the different technical widgets. This is the hardest group to educate. Except for professors. Professors are the hardest group to educate. Practitioners are probably the second hardest. Database and documentation, the values, certainly not a panacea, but a lot of insights that you can get out of large-scale optimization. How you actually might do as in a technical way, integrated water management and portfolio planning, and the benefits of integrating economics and engineering in your view of these problems. And then in the course of doing these kinds of studies, we found that we actually have some value that I had not completely realized. We had not completely realized when we began this, which is in the state of California, we're one of the few really independent technical shops. So that we don't work for Metropolitan Water District. We don't work for Westlands. We don't work for the environmentalists. We work with them, but we don't work for them. And so we can come up with a very independent technical perspective on these things because we're not interested in pushing one side or the other. We're just interested in what we think is actually makes sense. And so this has sort of a troublemaking aspect that some of you that are familiar with our work have probably seen. So we've done a lot of work on this, 10 years, got a bunch of hyperactive academics and a huge number of students. We've got all kinds of papers published. There's one coming out now in Water Resources Research where we took the loose title of it is taking the super drought of 900 AD and seeing what it would do in the year 2020 to California's water system. But we look at all kinds of things, ending overdraft, Hetchy restoration, all kinds of climate change studies, water marketing, facility expansions, all kinds of stuff. So let me go through some of these really quickly. The first big study, 2001, we looked at mostly water marketing aspects and capacity expansion issues. And we ran this model in a couple of different ways. We ran it first for each region of the state. We had divided the state up into 5 different regions, and we ran it independently for each region. So we had boundary conditions on each region of flows coming from other regions that were kept fixed, but we optimized all the decisions inside, and then we'd run a statewide model where we optimized the totality of California. And so we did this a couple of different ways. We had a base case that represented 1997 water operating policy, so we had sort of a simulation result here. It was actually highly constrained to operate that way. And then we had a regional water market case where each of these regions operated optimally, but the boundary conditions were fixed to the same as the base case simulation results. And then we had the statewide water market activity where, in principle, the Bay Area and Southern California could have sucked Northern California dry. There's no physical, except for the capacity constraints, there's no reason why you couldn't. And out of this, you see some really interesting things. Certainly, optimization should be able to make things better, right? And that happens. And you don't see, in the statewide market case, Southern California sucking Northern California dry. You know, they're still getting better for the most part, not getting any worse. The other thing you see is in the regional water markets that most of the improvement you see from base case to ideal case, in a sense, comes from water marketing activity within the region of Southern California. And this was overwhelmingly taking water from Imperial Irrigation District and selling it to Metropolitan Water District. That was worth maybe $900 million a year. Certainly the Imperial Irrigation District folks understand this, which is why they're trying to charge a lot of money for Metropolitan Water District to buy their water. Again, for each of these water users, we have conservation of mass constraints. We can look at the Lagrange multiplier on those conservation of mass constraints and see what's their marginal willingness to pay for additional water. We can do this for every irrigation district for every month out of the 72 years of hydrology. And so this is for just some example irrigation districts. Most of them get better. The ones that sell water to urban areas get a little bit worse. Cities do tremendously better because they have very, very high willingness to pay for water. For economic value of increasing capacity of water management facilities for reservoirs, you see them here, the statewide water management that goes down a little bit. All of these were really pretty small. We didn't see a lot of value in building new surface storage, despite what you see in the bond. It's not to say there isn't any benefit, but we didn't see much in this model yet. We saw a lot of value in expanding different kinds of conveyance facilities, particularly the Colorado River Aqueduct and an intertie between the Contra Costa Water District and East Bay Mud, and then various water recharge and wastewater recycling operations. We can also look at these Lagrange multipliers on the environmental flow constraints, and we can see that for some environmental flows, they don't really cause much trouble at all for the economic purposes of the system, and others have pretty high economic costs. In the case of Mono and Owens Lake, those are very high elevation environmental flows, and the economic cost there is overwhelmingly, or certainly the vast majority of it, is from lost hydropower. Taking that high elevation water and sucking all the energy out of it, releasing it at sea level through the Hyperion treatment plant. And you can see effects of refuges and things like that as well. Well, we can look at conjunctive use. I'll skip over this one. It's a little more complex. The next study is looking at climate warming. We want to look at climate warming not just with climate warming in today's environment, because that's really irrelevant. Climate warming is really going to have an effect in the future when we have more people and we have changes in land use and we have changes in agricultural technology and things like that. So we try to include all that. Certainly for climate warming, we have less spring. This is the black one is the current average monthly flows and availability. And with climate warming, we're going to lose a lot of that spring snow melt, and we'll have a lot more flow probably in the wintertime. How can the system adapt to all this? I'll sort of flip through this. So we had 5 different runs, a base case, same as before, a statewide water market, same as before, statewide water market with 2,100 conditions of population and land use and technology, same condition, only now a dry warm or a wet warm hydrology. And you can see not too much change for urban, big changes for ag, primarily if it's dry, some changes in operating costs, about $1 billion or so a year, $2 billion a year, overwhelmingly felt in the agricultural sector. And it's felt in the agricultural sector for 2 reasons. First of all, many of the agricultural users get shorted because there's less water. And then second of all, many of the urban users that would be shorted, they buy water from agriculture, lower valued agriculture. Another study we did, 2004. This is the closest, probably the closest that a computer model has ever come to a Pulitzer Prize. We did this study. It was getting some play around, and Tom Philp from the Sacramento Bee at the time saw it and understood, after reading it, a little bit more about the Hetch-Hetchy system and the Hetch-Hetchy problem. And based on these model results, actually, he wrote a series of editorials in the Sacramento Bee, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And I was really surprised when he won the prize. He gave us a call and invited us to the ceremony and said nice things about how this model led to him getting this Pulitzer Prize. So it's amazing, you know, this little technical stuff you do with numbers. People make high literature out of it. Not me, but other people. So those of you that probably know something about Hetch Hetchy, if you go to San Francisco and drink the water, this is where it comes from. Largely, it's a problem of you have these reservoirs up here and a larger reservoir, actually much larger reservoir downstream on the same river near Don Pedro. And what we found in the model results is that if you built a small intertie between New Don Pedro and the Hetch Hetchy aqueduct, and you got rid of Hetch Hetchy, that in almost every year you saw no shortage. You had enough storage capacity on that system that if you lost some of it, it interfered with the reliability relatively little. And in the years when you did have that loss of reliability, you could probably purchase some of that water from some of the irrigators and others. Now, it's an amazingly simple study, probably the simplest study we ever did, but you know, hey, it's pretty good. But there's, you know, again, lots of numbers behind all these. There's always a question, this model's been around for 10 years, does it work? Frankly, I'm amazed that it even runs. You know, this is a huge model. It's got maybe 1 million or so decision variables in it. When you press the button and actually numbers come out after a few days, it's pretty amazing that you can actually represent this kind of thing technically. Beyond that, I've been even more surprised that it seems to actually work, that it generates the kinds of insights and the kinds of changes in operations that are actually occurring. So my favorite of these is actually what I mentioned before, the idea of developing an intertie between Contra Costa Water District and East Bay Mud. When we first talked about this publicly, we got a lot of feedback, let me put it that way, from East Bay Mud and Contra Costa saying, oh, no, this has got to be crazy. You know, we never do this, and blah, 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 blah. Well, today it exists. And in fact, they knew it. But the model pointed out quite well. Most of the water marketing activities that you see in terms of Imperial Irrigation District in the South Coast or the State Water Project, reoperations and water sales to Castaic and Antelope Valley, and many of the sales in Sacramento Valley, you see those in these early model runs. It's not that they saw the model runs and they changed the operation. California is already operated by thousands of very smart people. They were pursuing these kinds of things on their own. So we sort of have independent verification of it. A lot of conjunctive use activities that are predicted by the model. You see people doing those kind of things in the field, and then the relatively small value of expanded storage. You see people not really jumping forth, volunteering to pay for new surface storage. I want to touch a little bit on a model we did south of the border. We had a wonderful Mexican PhD student, Josue Medellin, who's now part of our regular professional team. He's our lead Calvinist, as I call him. And he was interested in the water problems of Baja California, so he said, well, why don't you make a Baja Calvin? And so he did that. And this just sort of shows how the major water uses in this system and the major water supplies in blue. Overwhelmingly large supply is from the Colorado River, the treaty obligation. And they're looking at lots of different kinds of activities, and you'd like to, again, look at a portfolio of these activities. And so we did that for down there. We collaborated with some wonderful folks down at UABC in Ensenada on this work. Some master's students and professors there. And it seems to work. We had to develop our own economic models down there, or Josue did in particular. We looked at these different kinds of water management alternatives. Here's a simplified schematic of their region. We always start with a schematic. It helps us make sense of things. And we can see economic benefits for different combinations. Particularly, they have a large aqueduct there that they probably need to look to expand to take more water from the Colorado River to Tijuana. And this shows how different expansions of that canal capacity affect water scarcity and water scarcity costs for that region. Another thing that they look at a lot, people often talk about it even in California, is seawater desalination. It's certainly one of those technologies that has been promising for a very, very long time. Since the 1960s, people have been saying, just a few years now, we'll have seawater almost too cheap to meter. You know, it still has to come down quite a bit more in price. It's certainly promising, and it works pretty well, I think, now for brackish water under some circumstances. We might see desalinization of seawater becoming economical, but we still have a long way to go on it. So more research is needed. That's It's always a good thing to say to a research university crowd. Again, for the Baja California system, we found a lot of benefits from that model in terms of improving our understanding, looking at the role of water markets in the management and the development of infrastructure, because water markets actually provide a lot of flexibility in these systems and provide incentives for people to cooperate rather than just fight quite often. We found that wastewater reuse is quite promising, but desalinization still has a ways to go. Overall, on this large topic of hydroeconomic modeling, all models have a lot of limitations. One of my favorite quote on models is from George Box, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think this is always important to keep in mind when you're talking to somebody about your model results that you're very excited about. So we've tried very hard to be the first people to document our model's limitations and not be the last ones, because we think we should, as the model developers, we should be the ones that know most about the model's limitations. And it just sort of improves the conversation if you do that way. Certainly for any model like this, you have data problems. And in fact, one of the reasons why you develop a model like this is to better identify the data problems. How many of you in your technical studies have all the data you want? Right? You can do this with a great deal of assurance in almost any technical audience. How many people have all the data you want? No, almost no one will ever raise their hand unless they're being cheeky, right? Because we always have to say as our profession that we need to have more data. But in fact, we often have enough data to make some very important decisions. So you want to identify and separate out the data problems from the real data problems. There's certainly a lot of limitations in terms of the network flow algorithm and formulation, those kinds of things. This is an optimization model. Optimization models, you have to be careful of them because they are sometimes too smart. Just like a simulation model of this kind of system will be too stupid, the optimization model will be too smart, and you have to keep that in mind when you interpret the results. One problem that we've been having for a long time now is the lack of a simulation model. You'd like to ideally have a dialogue between the simulation model that has a little more truth to it in terms of the institutional aspects and some of the detailed physics than the simulation model, the optimization model that you have to simplify things for. And fortunately, some of this is coming along, not nearly as fast as we'd like, but it's improving. And again, it's never finished. Any model that's being used or is useful is never finished, certainly of a complex system. The only time it's finished is when you've given up on it. Okay. That's always something to keep in mind. So just some quick lessons to end up here. This is a very big project. We had a very, we did this by defining it fairly narrowly as much as we can. We decided not to do a lot of things because they'd be just crazy to do. There'll always be a lot of kind of interesting development aspects. We run this model to develop insights, not to develop numbers. We're really interested in coming up with ideas that will be useful in helping people think through this very difficult problem. And so some of the things we look at are the role of the delta, the role of portfolio solutions, that there really aren't any shortages, except there's really shortages only of cheap water, things like that. Again, more portfolios. One of the things I want to highlight is that often scientific information is inconvenient or difficult for policy discussions to handle. And I think as technical people, this is one of the most challenging things we have is how do we develop this information and communicate this information in a way that's useful for people that really have a very difficult problem on their hands. Not only difficult technically, but difficult politically and socially. So certainly in this regard and in others, many technical ways, we have more adventures to come. So I'll run over time only a little bit, hopefully, and give you a moment for questions.
Thanks, Jay. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, the state legislature and the governor put through this large package of bills leading to something on the ballot related to water. What role did Calvin play in those activities?
I don't know that Calvin itself played a role in those activities. Those discussions are very much removed from technical things. There are some paragraphs in that bill that came out of discussions we had at Davis on the Delta in particular, and some of those discussions on the Delta and Davis involve the Calvin model. I think some of the discussions, some of the people that were involved in those discussions had seen Calvin results, and so I think there's some caution on some elements of infrastructure that reflects some of the caution that we see coming out of the Calvin model. But I wouldn't say that the Calvin model was directly implemented into legislation. That would be completely naive.
I haven't seen that water bill, but I know about a year ago they were talking about this, what used to be called the peripheral canal. I don't know what you called it on your slide, if you even did, but how does that fit in? Is that worth building? And
We had a larger study on the peripheral canal. We'll have a book coming out with UC Press in February on the delta and the peripheral canal. And as part of that study, we did a lot of Calvin model runs to see, well, what's the economic benefits of different sizes of peripheral canal or not having any water exports from the delta at all. And we looked at different ways of regulating flows through the delta and the sort of statewide economic and water management implications of it. And we found that if you didn't have a canal and you ended all the water exports in sort of a planned, thoughtful way in the distant future, say by 2050, it would be a big cost to to California's economy in the order of several $billion a year. But it would not be catastrophic in the sense of you would still have civilization in California, which, if you listen to some parties, they would say, well, and maybe for their own local area, civilization would end, but certainly not for the state of California.
Thank you. I have a question about Calvin's assessment that new surface water storage facilities don't really make sense. And I'm wondering, in reality, a lot of the reluctance to build those has to do with social kind of ill will towards new dams or environmental protection concerns.
Certainly.
Does Calvin predict those as well? Does Calvin factor those in?
We just look at the economics.
As purely economics.
I mean, you might have other reasons why you think those dams are good or bad.
Right. But Calvin only looks
Your
at the
brother-in-law might
economics.
own a construction company. But this is just the numbers on the economics and the technical side.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have more stuff than you'll ever want to read on the websites if you're interested, both for Calvin and Baja Calvin. And I'll be around for a little bit afterwards, and you can always come up to Davis and visit me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.